Hello and welcome to Unit 2 on Political Institutions. This is probably the most important unit of the course because it really gets down into the nitty-gritty of how states, how regimes, how governments create policy, how decisions are made, and how leaders gain and maintain power within the system. So today, you can see there's 9 topics. Today we're going to really be focusing on the first 2 topics that focus on parliamentary, presidential, and semi-presidential systems. So what do we mean when we say parliamentary, presidential, and semi-presidential systems? Really what we're talking about and what we're focusing on are our democratic forms of government. The United Kingdom, Nigeria, Mexico, and to some extent Russia, since Russia does have some democratic political institutions in place, even though much of that power has been usurped by the president, Vladimir Putin. So, I asked you to read about Mexico prior to coming to class today. So based on your reading on Mexico, would you classify Mexico as a parliamentary, presidential, or semi-presidential system? And why? Go ahead and pause the video briefly and think about that. Hopefully you identified Mexico as a presidential system, not only because they have a president, and that is not, just because a country has a president doesn't automatically make them a presidential system, but hopefully you considered the fact that Mexico has separation of powers, a directly elected president, and a legislature with checks on executive power and the ability to remove executives from power if need be. So the main difference we want to look at here is the differences between parliamentary and presidential systems. So when it comes to parliamentary systems, our main example is the United Kingdom. Parliamentary systems such as the United Kingdom combine the lawmaking and executive functions. To put that another way, the legislative and executive branches are fused together. The Prime Minister, who is the head of government, is a Minister of Parliament, just like any other Minister of Parliament, so essentially they are first among equals. They derive their power from being the head of the political party who holds a majority in Parliament. In the case of the United Kingdom, that would be the House of Commons. In a presidential system, such as Mexico or Nigeria, the president is directly elected by the people. So the president is not responsible, the president forms a cabinet who is responsible to the elected executive. And the legislature can only remove cabinet members or the executive through impeachment. Now when I say cabinet, I mean essentially when I say cabinet, I'm talking about the government. Okay, so in a parliamentary system, the prime minister will form a cabinet, and that cabinet is the government. They drive policy in the House of Commons. In Nigeria and Mexico, the president will also form a cabinet. That cabinet will drive policy from the executive branch and attempt to get legislation passed through the legislative branch. So presidential systems, like I said, have separate fixed-term popular elections for the national legislature and the top executive leader, who serves usually as both the head of state and head of government. If you're a more visual learner, this might be helpful. So within a parliamentary system, voters elect ministers of parliament, or MPs, through direct elections in districts throughout the country. Within those MPs, after those elections, a party becomes the majority party in Parliament, and the leader of that party will become the Prime Minister, who will then appoint a cabinet, and that becomes the government. All right? And the government is within the legislature. That's what we mean when we say a fusion of powers. Now, in a presidential system, there is separation. The president and the cabinet form what is often called the executive branch, and they comprise the government. So the president is the head of government, they appoint their cabinet and they control the bureaucracy of the country, as opposed to the legislature, who is a completely separate branch of government with their own elections. And these two branches can either work together for policy objectives, or they can be at odds if the legislature and the executive are controlled by different parties. A semi-presidential system is, simply put, a combination of the two. So a semi-presidential system, it might also be called a dual executive system, is a system of government in which a president exists alongside a prime minister and a cabinet, with the latter being responsible to the legislature of the state. Russia is our primary example of a semi-presidential system. Russia features popular elections for the president and for the national legislature, which is known as the Duma. And then the president, Vladimir Putin in this case, appoints the prime minister with the approval of the Duma. So the prime minister currently is Mikhail Mishustin. Putin, over time, has gradually concentrated power around the presidency. So he has the power to appoint the prime minister, who would be coming from the dominant party in the Duma. And the dominant party at this point in time is almost guaranteed to be United Russia, because the Russian Federation is absolutely under what you would call one-party rule, much like Mexico was under the PRI prior to the early 2000s. So when we look at parliamentary, presidential, and semi-presidential systems side by side, we'll see that in the United Kingdom, they combine the lawmaking and executive functions. There's that fusion of power, which allows the national legislature to select and remove the head of government and cabinet. In Mexico and Nigeria, they feature a cabinet that is mostly responsible to the elected executive, that makes the government, with a legislature that can only remove cabinet members through impeachment. These systems have separate fixed-term popular elections for the national legislature and a top executive leader serving as both head of state and head of government. In the semi-presidential system, Russia, separate popular elections for the president and the national legislature, allowing the president to nominate a prime minister, who must be approved by the legislature. Members of the cabinet are held accountable by both president and legislature. So take a moment here and just look at some of the differences between parliamentary and presidential systems. You can see that the president, of course, is directly elected by the people in a presidential system, whereas the prime minister is from the majority party, right? Voters vote for ministers of parliament in the House of Commons, and the head of that party becomes the prime minister. They serve at the pleasure of they're formally appointed by the Queen and essentially serve at the pleasure of their party. If the party loses confidence, they can hold a vote of no confidence and remove the prime minister from power. Presidential systems feature separation of powers, while parliamentary systems feature that fusion that I referenced earlier. That plays into independent branches, right? Presidential forms of government have independent branches of government. Again, in a parliamentary system, those branches are fused. In a presidential system, the president is usually the head of state and the head of government. Well, in a parliamentary system, the prime minister is the head of government, and the president or a monarch is often a ceremonial head of state. Parliamentary systems have fewer institutional obstacles to enact policy, so you might say they can be more efficient in terms of policy making. But they also have their own checks on the executive branch. So parliaments may censure cabinet members, essentially a public admonishment. They may refuse to pass executive proposed legislation, although this doesn't happen very often because, again, the prime minister comes from the majority party. They may question the executive and cabinet members. This usually happens formally in the UK during what's called question time. And they may impose time deadlines on calling new elections. So that, in a nutshell, is parliamentary versus presidential systems. You kind of got the lowdown of what a presidential system is, what a parliamentary system is, and what some of the similarities and differences are between them.